The world is deep, deeper than day can comprehend. You're listening to Deeper Than Day, the depth psychology and archetypal astrology podcast. We're your hosts, Jessica Garfield-Kabbara
and Delia Shargell. To enter this dialogue with us, visit our blog at deeperthanday.com.
It is April 24th, 2017, and we're excited for the second session of Deeper Than Day. Today, we're going to talk about Mercury retrograde and therapy. Right now, Mercury is retrograde. It began on April 10th at 4 degrees Taurus, and it goes back to 24 degrees Aries and stations direct on May 3rd. So we have about one more week of Mercury retrograde. And Delia and I wanted to talk today about what Mercury retrograde evokes in each of us. So let's talk about the meaning of Mercury and retrograde.
Well, I wanted to start by acknowledging that this is our second attempt at this podcast because when we started a few days ago, we ran into so many technical difficulties that we had to abandon the mission. And I was thinking about how in the collective consciousness, even people who are not astrologically informed are now pretty much cognizant of the concept of Mercury retrograde. The idea that it's a time when communications go awry, when things break down, when we expect things to go a certain way and then we seem to be thwarted because of the association with the astronomical concept of retrogradation, when the planets appear to move backwards. And, I'm assuming that in the ancient times, this was a symbol of things going horribly wrong, that the cosmic order of things is going not as expected, and that we need to see this as an ill omen, and that kind of, that superstition seems to carry down to the present moment.
Yeah, all the way to, technology breaking down. Oftentimes people feel like they lose their phone or they crack it or their computer crashes and there's a loss. There's some kind of loss of work and effort, and the frustration that goes along with that. And that it's a time period to be avoided or to just kind of bear and grit, buckle down and wait for it to be over. And I think that although that those things are very true and there's real practical things that we can do to prepare for Mercury retrograde, which we'll get into, I think it's also important to do a Mercury retrograde to Mercury retrograde,
yes,
which is to rethink and review and revision the meaning and the creative intelligence of why this phenomenon happens 3 times every year for 3 weeks, and that it's built into the very fabric of our solar system, and there must be a reason for that. That must be in service of something. And I hope that comes through today as well.
Absolutely. I think that's a super important thing for us to do. And along those lines, that's part of what we want to address in the content, that we are thinking about how Mercury retrograde works with the whole body of psychotherapy, that as a practice, we are using psychotherapy as a time to reflect and to reimagine and re-understand our relationship to our being, but also, very profoundly, often in the way that we think about ourselves.
That really reminds me of a new way of starting to think about Mercury retrograde that has come through during this Mercury retrograde for me is the word remember. So it's a time period to reflect and to go inward, to reimagine, but it's also a time period of remembering. And for me, remembering is a way to reconnect and awaken to parts of ourselves that we have either become disconnected from or have forgotten entirely about. And so there's this quality of unveiling, of seeing through, of what was once there, or either reframing speaking psychologically, the stories that we live by that give us our sense of self. And that psychotherapy in of itself, and this is what you pointed out to me, Delia, is essentially one big Mercury retrograde expression, is because we are going in and we're essentially reframing our lives so we can come into healing contact with ourselves by looking at what's happened in a different way.
Absolutely. And I think it's a pretty fascinating concept, because it turns that, that idea of relating to something superstitiously on its head. It reframes the idea of having to go back and re-examine and re-know ourselves much more positively, and makes meaning and makes use of that experience. So exactly, psychotherapy is often the process of allowing ourselves to become more and more conscious of the lens through which we see the world. And this relates profoundly to Mercury, because Mercury has everything to do with the mind, with the thoughts, with communication. It's fluid and quick, and it changes constantly. It's incredibly curious and mercurial. And what we are doing when we undergo the process of psychotherapy is we bring thoughts back into relationship with the things that are less conscious, with our feelings, with our bodies, and with what we call the unconscious organizing principles, which are the belief systems that are so profound and so deep that they actually affect the way we see everything. But without being conscious of them, without being able to reflect on them, they're simply ruling our lives. And that goes along with the process that Rick Tarnas teaches us about, that we are without an awareness of the archetypal principles, we are their puppets. We are, simply locked into a process of unconsciously identifying with the archetypal principles that are moving through us. But if we can become more aware of what's happening and how we understand these things moving through us, as we understand our belief systems, we can work with them to express these things more clearly and more in coherence with our beings.
You're really talking about the archetype of Mercury being an organ of perception, and the nature of mind being able to, as a vehicle, become conscious and aware of these really deep organizing unconscious principles that not only give us our sense of self, but, like you're saying, color and shape the way that we see the world and see one another. And that in itself is world creating.
Yes.
And so the thoughts and the beliefs and the perceptions all relating back to Mercury, and also Mercury relating to language. And so our ability to begin to communicate and to express ourselves and our ideas and our feelings is all happening through this transmission of Mercury. And I think that part of what is so significant of the retrograde time period is it is this time period of slowing down, turning things around, and instead of this constantly forward moving process that Mercury has in its kind of quicksilver nature, instead it's about actually going backwards and a certain unraveling to take place so we can see what is behind our sense of self and what is behind these patterns in our lives that have come to be, so that we can have more of a choice in our relationship of how we are with these different organizing principles.
Beautifully said. And I think what you're naming here is that a Mercury retrograde phenomenon brings us to that sort of reflective process. But I want you to talk a little more about the principle of Mercury and its quicksilver nature, and the fact, how what we're talking about differs from that kind of impulse.
Mercury being the closest planet to the sun, its orbital period is the quickest out of all the planets in the solar system. And so, when we look at its physical properties astronomically, we see it is the quickest moving planet. And it has that nature. It is extremely speedy. Mercury is the lower octave of Uranus, the outer planet. So they both have this quality of quickness, speed, electricity. And Mercury, Hermes, the messenger of the gods, was the only one that was able to freely go between the above and the below realms, to pass through the gates. And so there's something about Mercury that's not only quick, but also kind of boundary crossing, the ability to go in between realms or worlds freely and quickly. So that traversing and that movement. And so there's a certain fluidity to Mercury.
That's great. Yeah. Were you going to say something else?
Oh, I was just reminded of something that you said before in relating to Mercury's quality of also being hermaphroditic as well.
Yes, right. I mean, that idea that Mercury being hermaphroditic, being able to cross genders, can see from all perspectives, and that shift in perspective is really profound. That I think so much about how our perspective, as you were saying earlier, forms everything that we know, and that often if we can shift perspective on something, we reframe it and we see it in a completely new way and understand it more fully. So that kind of fluidity of perspective is hugely important. I also think we have to name that we live in an incredibly mercurial culture, and as you and I live in cities, and in cities we experience that kind of constant barrage of communication and thought and technology. And here in the Bay Area, it's really, really in your face, that we are now connected to each other constantly in a way that we have never been before through technology. We can reach each other always, and we are bombarded by thoughts of every color, shape, and size at all moments.
Rapid communication, rapid exchange of information, knowledge is becoming more widely accessible more quickly through social media and the internet, and this is all dominated by Mercury. Also, we live in a very cognocentric society in the West, which favors the mental functions, the mental ego as self. The sense of self and the mental ego have become synonymous as one thing. But the intellect, the mind, science, analysis, rational thought, these are all things that the post-enlightenment and really champions in the West. And so we very much are identified in the modern times of with the planet Mercury.
With the planet Mercury, with our minds. And this is such an important point, that from a cognocentric perspective, if this is what we see, this is our lens, this is also what we value. And part of the reason for the process of psychotherapy, of coming back into relationship with our soul, which, having been relegated to the unconscious, then begins to exert a force and a pressure on our being and is seeking expression. We are having to come in a more intentional way back into relationship with what our feelings and our intuition teach us, as well as our rational knowledge. So it's like we are remembering through this process of psychotherapy our relationship to the whole.
And I think we're remembering these other languages, these other forms of communicating, like using our feelings and our emotions and intuition, let alone what's happening in, for example, morphogenetic fields and psychic phenomenon, which is actually, we're realizing more and more that not only is mind not just inside the brain, it's not even inside our bodies. Mind permeates the entire cosmos. And so mind is also in environments. So when you go to certain morphic fields, like the morphic field of San Francisco, there's a certain type of mind, a field of energy that is there, memories that have been stored from experiences. And so we're reawakening and remembering different ways to not only communicate and listen to one another and express ourselves, but also different ways to learn and exchange wisdom and knowledge beyond just a didactic model of one person being a master, having all the information, telling the other person, and the other person memorizes it or maybe learns it through experience if they're lucky, and now they have it.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually turns out that's a really ineffective and inefficient way to transmit and communicate vast bodies of knowledge and information. That there's actually other ways that we can do that with one another.
Absolutely. But, as I keep harping on, the lens through which we see affects how we see and what we can see. And from the modern perspective, the idea that we really are our minds, that's the only way that knowledge can be transmitted. It's from master to student in that intellectual and rational way. So as we are changing our understanding of the nature of mind, we are opening ourselves to these other forms of knowing and other languages and other ways of communicating with each other, which may be much richer and perhaps even much more efficient.
And I would say much more honoring to the goddess and to the divine. I mean, part of what you're talking about here really reminds me of the fact that right now Mercury is conjunct Uranus in the sky, and Uranus as the liberator, the awakener. I can feel this sense of almost imprisonment or kind of deprivation that we've had of our understanding of the planet Mercury. Like it's almost too confined, it's too limited. We often look at Mercury in the birth chart and say, oh, that's the principle of mind, communication, it's the way you think, it's the way you learn. And yes, that's all true, but what if we radically expand our understanding of what it means to have mind and to think and to learn? It's almost like I feel myself wanting the mercurial principle to be liberated right now. And the Mercury Uranus is tried Saturn very tight. And so we're honoring the way that it's been in the tradition and the way that it's shown up in patriarchy in the modern era. And then I can feel the Uranian principle saying, yes, and there's so much more. Let's break free of this.
Exactly. And I love that you're naming the higher octave nature, that we are, as we begin to open to what the transpersonal archetypes have to teach us, they re-inform and revitalize the more personal planetary archetypes, the things that we feel familiar with, and we do, and that are affected or that are related to our traditions. And so, yes, I feel that very much in this conversation, that the Uranian energy of liberation and change and technology, that all of the things that we are learning and discerning about learning really does serve to highlight how imprisoned in our rational minds we have been. And, I was just kind of re-listening to the sentences that we said before. And I've, of course, forgotten the word that I used, but there was something about, efficient. Like that is such an old paradigm word, but it's so effective. I mean, it's so connected with the idea that we must be accomplishing and producing at all moments. And I think your connection to the language of the goddess brings us back into relationship with the feeling that there is so much more that is needing to come through us now.
I love that. And it really draws, my attention to looking at our education system and the way that we raise children. And for so long, I've said, if we look at the chart of the child, but if we look at where Mercury is, it tells us a lot about the learning style of that child. And we can begin to actually create systems and ways of communicating and teaching with our young ones based upon understanding how best their Mercuries feel at home and fluent. What languages do their Mercuries want to be fluent in?
Oh, you are speaking my language. I mean, it's such a beautiful vision of what a world could be where we could actually do that. And instead of focusing on efficiency and the bottom line and how we close the minds of children so that they don't act up and they become, efficient worker bees, which has been our model for a very, very long time. If we could actually attune to, we're so focused on the idea of the individual, but if we actually attuned to the individual and had the capacity to do that, we could do exactly what you're saying. And each child could be honored in their unique capacities and their unique gifts. And their education could be tailored to exactly who they are.
I mean, that would completely change what psychotherapy was. We would, the content of what we would have to be processing. I mean, so much of psychotherapy is about shedding of these conditioned layers that have imprisoned the client or the patient into a place of self that feels so inauthentic because they weren't actually seen as a child and they weren't actually respected and honored. I wanted at first to say we'd be out of jobs, but no, we wouldn't. Our healing process of facilitating connection with self would just change in possibly its mode and its content. But let's ground, this Mercury retrograde back into the birth chart and kind of segue into, so what does it mean if you have Mercury retrograde when you're born? And, I wanted to offer a couple things here in regards to this, and then turn it over to you, Delia, which is for me, when I see Mercury retrograde in the chart of somebody, I tend to come at it from a soul level, meaning I ask myself, okay, what is it that this person, this lifetime, is here to, in a really deep and profound way, review and revision? And so whatever else Mercury is aspecting in the chart, whether that's by conjunction, opposition, square, usually it's more the harder dynamic aspects, but it could also be the trine or the sextile. For me, I think it's helpful to look at it and go, let's see, if Mercury retrograde is conjunct the sun, it would be seen indicative that this lifetime was a lifetime to review and revision self and to really get a different perspective, a different take on what oneself was, what one's identity was, how one creatively expresses oneself as an individual in the world, and that the whole lifetime is one long arc of this unfolding process.
That's beautiful, and seems probably, well, this is your observation. This is what you see. So, I was born with Mercury retrograde, and it's not in aspect to my son, but it is. I've been trying to reflect on how I've related to that in my life, and one of the things that I can say about the Mercury process in me is that I have always seemed to come at things backwards. In my own experience, I tend to, it's hard for me to put it into words, but I have tended to not travel the path that was expected, but sort of unwind it and start somewhere else. And okay, let's refocus.
Yeah. I've actually have a lot to say about your Mercury retrograde in your chart.
I just did that thing where, I started to close down because I was like, oh, I'm going to talk about myself in public. So go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to prompt and to reflect that your Mercury retrograde is at the 29th degree of Leo, mm-hmm. and it is in your 10th house, mm-hmm. and it is actually in conjunction with your natal Pluto, Uranus, and Venus. Mm-hmm. And for all of you who are familiar with us from the other podcasts where we do correlations, you will know that Delia often refers to her Venus, Uranus, Pluto triple conjunction there in Virgo. But I don't think I've ever heard you mention Mercury in there. And the thing that I love about that is that not only is Mercury in an 11-degree conjunction with Venus and a 15-degree conjunction with Pluto, which is at the edge of the orb of influence that we use in archetypal astrology, but that the Mercury retrograde, the part of Mercury retrograde that you were born in, Mercury was tightly conjunct the Pluto, Uranus, Venus the week before you were born. And so it actually tightens that into a quadruple stellium. So one, I feel that part of your Mercury retrograde this lifetime is actually you being able to not only voice, but own that your Mercury, your voice, your message that you're here to communicate this lifetime is one that is Venusian, about love, relationships, beauty. It's highly creative. It's Uranian. It's about revolution, freedom, astrology, the new paradigm, and Pluto. It's deeply transformative. It's related to depth psychology. I mean, right there, Uranus and Pluto. Pluto, depth psychology, Uranus, astrology. Mercury, you're here to give voice to that. That's what you do. That's who you are. And yet there's something about it that's kind of slippery and backward and difficult to really see and honor as you.
Well, that's absolutely true. And I have to say that I guess in a nutshell, my lifetime is actually about disidentifying from wounding. And I think that on a larger cultural level, that goes along with the process that I am always trying to promote in people, that as we are waking up from the old paradigm, we are shedding that kind of that mental limitation. And, my own experience, it feels like William Blake's mind-forged manacles, the way that I see that imprisons my soul in a way that makes it so difficult for me to continue to claim and own all of the things that you just talked about, which are, exactly, that's what I love, it's what I am, and it's what I want to talk about. But there's something about that feeling of limitation in myself that has always made it very hard to do. And as I'm coming forward more in a more public way, like on this podcast, and speaking about that part of myself, I have to go through all of the shedding of the restrictions that this complex in my being has held me inside of.
Most definitely. And it would make sense that the Mercury would be something that had a lot of charge for you, speaking and writing, that a charge positively, and that, you have a lot to say, you have a lot to offer, you love to write, you love to read, you love to communicate. That's what you do. But yet there's also charge to it in a way that's challenging, which is like, sometimes that feels difficult and there's maybe a collapsing. And so there can be something about Mercury retrograde in the chart that not only has a kind of slowness to it and it coming to fruition or manifestation, but there can even be a sense of shame or limitation around Mercury in one's life. And so then one can feel kind of thwarted or stuck. We even see it at times with people who have learning disabilities or are perceived to have learning disabilities, where the cognitive function doesn't operate in what the modern paradigm considers normal, which is a very narrow, restrictive bandwidth that's extremely unfortunate. And so, the last things I'll say about it is, because Mercury's in your 10th house, it makes so much sense that one of the main areas or domains of your life that it would come through is professionally. And how perfect is it that you're a psychotherapist? And essentially psychotherapy is all this Mercury retrograde process, as we talked about earlier. And there it is in your 10th house. And that's what you do. And that's who you are.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, I see this in other people and I see it in myself, that it is often easier for us, for instance, to feel compassion for others than it is for us to feel compassion for ourselves. It's easier for me to promote in other people the process that it is, it feels limited in myself to actually express and live. So yeah, I mean, I'm laughing because I remember the first time I was actually able to claim the Mercury in the conjunction with Venus, Uranus, and Pluto. Matthew Stelzner said, "Look, Niels, come on, face it. You are a Mercury, Uranus, Pluto person. Just own it." And I literally had to do that thing where I put up a Post-it on my door, and every time I left my house, I'm like, Matthew says I'm Mercury, Pluto, Uranus. So over the years, it's become a little easier for me.
Well, I think we all got that in our chart. I know I got my own version of that too.
Sure.
So I'm glad Matthew was there to help you out, and that's what he's good at doing, But I think there's also, and this is a nuanced thing, and we don't have to get too much into it now, but I think there's also something significant when any planet goes retrograde, when it moves from one sign to another. So in your case, Mercury was in Virgo,
Mm-hmm.
and then right when you were born, it had transitioned into Leo.
Mm-hmm.
And so, particularly when something is at the 29th degree in the astrological tradition, they call that the anaretic degree,
Mm-hmm.
the last degree. And that there often is a sense of urgency to learn some kind of lesson about that placement. And Leo is all about creative self-expression. And so it would make sense that when you go to express yourself versus helping to support somebody else do that, there would be something that would happen because there's a charge around that. There's something in the unconscious that's kind of tangled up there. And we have to assume that's probably from past life material and ancestral material.
Mm-hmm.
And that because it's opposite the fourth house, that there's a connection there to roots and home and the family and the past. But because it's in the 10th, but the area that you're really working it out is through your vocation, your career.
That's right. And I have often reflected on how I'm able to give myself permission through what I have learned in my career to live my life in a different way. We were talking earlier about boundaries. It's the same idea that I could set boundaries professionally. It gave me the permission to set boundaries personally. And I think that idea of the intense pressure in the anaretic degree to solve a karmic problem, all I can do is vouch for it and say, yes, I feel that.
Do you want to mention at all about when your progressed Mercury changed, or?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a pretty interesting story. So in a progressed chart, we often look at when something changes houses, when it changes signs. But when Mercury is retrograde, because it's a quick moving planet, it will often go direct at some point in the person's lifetime. So I looked at the year that my Mercury went direct. It was 1987, which is the year Jessica was born, and I was graduating from college. And it was the most intense experience of Mercury I can imagine. I was writing my undergraduate honors thesis on archetypes of the feminine in Victorian literary fairy tales. And I had an experience of writer's block that was so extraordinary. And it was complicated and a long story and caught up with many other things. But I will say that I ended up manifesting a psychogenic asthma. I was so sick that I literally could not breathe and nearly died. And I was I had to leave school before I graduated. I went into a year plus major depression. I had, was incredibly physically impaired. It was bad. And I had to go into retreat basically and kind of begin to heal, this very, very slow process before I could complete the thesis and defend it and graduate. And while I was doing that process of, just like in the depths of the depression, I actually started doing holotropic breath work for the first time. I was introduced to Groff, and my whole way of thinking and perceiving moved from a place where I was trying to cram myself into the rational and intellectual process of writing a thesis into seeing and understanding and knowing the world and the psyche and the unconscious and the all in a completely different way, which actually validated the feelings that I had always had and that I had been reaching for in this piece of work that I was trying so hard to accomplish in these narrow confines that were making me so sick. So it was a real revolution in my way of relating to Mercury, even though, it was not an easy path. And I think that it has only been with time that I've been able to reflect on that and understand more and more of its meaning in my life.
It's incredible how much time periods that feel extra karmic, and that there seems to be more dimension to them, more layers of our being affected. How often not only are these physical expressions, but the threshold, the thing that we must pass through, feels so immense, life or death, like it sounds like here. And it's just, to me, it's often indicative of the level of psyche that you're passing through in your own being, and the immensity that it's reflecting in the outer world.
Yeah, and I really think that it's powerful to keep that in mind when we're going through experiences that are impenetrable to us, that feel like, why am I having to face the feelings that I'm facing right now? Why is God punishing me, is the way I think about it a lot of the time. And that as we are able to use our minds to reflect on the awareness that possibly from another perspective, this will have a kind of meaning that will render it necessary and beautiful and some of the most important material of our lifetime, in the moment when we're in the soup, when we're identified with that experience, it is profoundly difficult to do that. So I think that it's, if we are able to when we are stuck in those emotional moments, we can bring the air of Mercury. We can bring the process of thinking and remembering that it is possible to see in a different way. That we may not be able to access that now, but we will, with time, perhaps be able to do that. And I think that that Mercury retrograde is a great metaphor for that possibility.
And I think that really reminds me of what Mercury retrograde time periods are about. When we have them in a world transit, we all are going through it at the same time, like we are right now. And just for me, how important it is for me to kind of approach it in two different ways. One, a very practical way. For example, because there's usually technological mishaps and loss of information, before every retrograde, I back up my entire computer. I back up my phone. I make sure that that's okay, so that in case something were to happen, I'm up to date on taking care of those things. So I don't need to fear the loss of, my work. And so I do that to kind of, in a Saturn practical kind of material way, best prepare. I also do my best to finish all tasks that need to be done before the retrograde starts, that I know that I can, so I can just be completed with it. And then what I can wait to do until after it's done, I try to do that. And that's not always possible, because 3 weeks can be a long time when you run a business or going to school or whatever it may be. But I try to be mindful of the approach going into the retrograde. Similarly, that I would be mindful of approaching a ceremony. If I was going into a meditation retreat or I was going into a medicine retreat, I would prepare myself physically by eating well, by cleansing, by making sure that I'm getting enough sleep and meditating and exercising. And I treat Mercury retrograde time periods spiritually as ceremonial time periods, so that as much as possible, I use it as a time period of retreat, so that I can honor the energy of the slowing down and going backwards as a time period of reflection, of remembering, of reimagining. And as much as I can, I allow the layers to be peeled off. So the first week, usually kind of just going through. And then the second week, starts to kind of feel like molasses to me, like, oh my goodness, is this retrograde ever gonna end? What, we have an entire another week? And then that last week, it's like, whoa. And it's almost like in moments in my meditation, I really can get to that place of like time standing still. And there's just so much revealed in those spaces when that is allowed to happen. And so I want to encourage everyone to have, you know, both approaches. One that's a practical, physical approach to the retrograde, dealing with technology and our belongings and our business, but also a spiritual one where whatever works for you and however you want to be intentional with the retrograde, just carving out as much as you can, little spaces of time for being with yourself, remembering who you are, remembering your truth, reflecting, and allowing yourself to go into meditative or contemplative states of consciousness, because Mercury retrograde is really fantastic for doing that kind of work.
I love what you just said, and it is such a practical and such a visionary way of using the transits in order to personally develop and channel everything that you can make available to yourself in doing that. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I was hoping that that I could read a little passage that talks about that is a beautiful, just as Jessica has just given us all, a beautiful reminder of how we can use our minds to reapproach something that is that we would otherwise take for granted and just rush through, which is what you've just talked about doing in a ceremonial and ritual way. So I wanted to read a little parable that Rick Tarnas quotes in Cosmos and Psyche about a meeting between Henry Fierce and Carl Jung in the 1950s. And I am reading it to just give an example of how Jung reapproached his thought. So Fierce had come to discuss whether Jung thought a manuscript by a scientist who had recently died should be published. At the appointed hour of 5 o'clock, Fierce arrived for the meeting and the discussion began. Jung had read the book and he thought that it should not be published, but I disagreed and was for publication. Our discussion finally got rather sharp, and Jung looked at his wristwatch, obviously thinking that he had spent enough time on the matter and that he could send me home. Looking at his watch, he said, "When did you come?" I, "At 5, as agreed." Jung, "But that's queer. My watch came back from the watchmaker this morning after a complete revision, and now I have 5:05. But you must have been here much longer. What time do you have?" I, "It's 5:35. Whereon Jung said, "So you have the right time and I the wrong one. Let us discuss the thing again." This time I could convince Jung that the book should be published.
I love that story.
I do too, and I think it's such a great window into Jung's ability to use synchronicities as a wake up, and that when we approach astrology as a massive series of synchronicities, as we understand that the universe and cosmos is constantly giving us these reminders and these ways of awakening to the unimaginable beauty and complexity of the all, then we get to do that. And I think that if we can use Mercury retrograde as an invitation to ritualize the doing that, the waking up to what we go unconscious to, we go into automatic pilot, and we close our minds and we stop thinking. I think it's a really good use of time.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that it's also really helpful when we're looking at our personal transits and looking at what the Mercury retrograde is aspecting in our own chart. It's extremely helpful for us to understand what might be some of the area of contemplation and of reflection. Every time Mercury stations retrograde, it's hitting some part in our chart, and that is the part of us, of ourself, that we can be ritualizing, that we can be meditating on. And I think that waking up that Jung is having in this synchronicity, I think that Mercury retrograde can be that waking up to this dimension of ourself that it's aspecting in our being. And that if we look honestly at our process that has been unfolding before the retrograde takes place, we know what the content is of our psychological journey. And what the retrograde is doing is it's just kind of raking us back over those things that we've been moving and that we've been metabolizing, moving forward, and said, let's just slow that down, integrate that more fully, and then let's move forward. And that the timing, the placement, those are not arbitrary. Those are meaningful and synchronistic. And if we just take the time to look, and we just take the time to sit and honestly review it, it's really just this treasure trove of insight and revelation and emotion coming up, bubbling up. And all of that is serving in the metabolization of our process that allows us to reconnect, to remember, and that is what allows healing and wholeness to move through.
Absolutely. I mean, when you speak, I just think about how every little detail of this symbolic language that astrology offers us opens us into that, that kind of blooming experience of meaning, and that it really is about taking the time and actually just doing what we are offered as an opportunity to do, that allows those experiences to give their gifts. I want to say that if we think about retrogradation of all of the planets in this way, that it's lovely that Mercury retrograde happens so frequently throughout the course of the year, that we have these opportunities to actually use this process to mentalize or symbolize, as we say in psychotherapy, to allow our minds to grasp what Richard Bolus called the unthought known, what we know in our being, but we've never actually thought, which doesn't give us a chance to relate to it or to have a relationship with it and to then become conscious of it.
And I think that that's just such, for me, an essential part of the psychotherapy. The psychotherapy is the space and is the relationship to be able to come in to this contact with ourself. And the astrology gives us, the frame. It gives us, they're both different forms of perception, but when they're brought together, they just exponentially enhance that ability to come into that contact. I mean, they, for me, are so medicinal for one another, and the alchemy that the two to do together is so much more powerful than one without the other. And I think that a lot of what it is in psychotherapy is the relationship with the therapist, being in relationship to that other who can help hold and mirror and reflect what it is that's going on in your process. And that the astrology also holds, reflects, and mirrors, but from a cosmic perspective. And it seems, at least this point in our human history, that we need both. We need both the human being, the flesh and the bones and the blood and the love and the heart, and then the cosmic mirroring, the transpersonal, the divine. And I think that is a lot of what we're doing here together, is helping the alchemy of the two swirl into deeper communion with one another.
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a beautiful alchemy. The phrase that comes to mind when you're saying that is mind womb. That we, in psychotherapy, we hold the therapist is holding in their mind womb the process of the client, so that it can gestate and become born through speech, if we're doing talk therapy, or any other way. So to give voice to the cosmos, that's our plan.
Oh, well, on that note, we're at time for today.
Yeah. All right.
We want to thank you all so much for being with us in our second session, and we really look forward to the next one very soon.
Yes, we do. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
The world is deep, deeper than day can comprehend.